family misses our anniversary until my husband shows up with a surprise. Before we begin the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and never miss more incredible stories every day. I was staring at 3 empty chairs on my 10th wedding anniversary when my husband placed a multi-million-dollar bank statement on the table. My name is Sarah. I'm 32 years old. I work as a middle school math teacher, and for my entire life, I have been the disappointing background character in my own family's grand production. My mother, Eleanor, is a woman who measures human worth entirely by zip codes, designer labels, and public prestige. In her eyes, my quiet, steady life is a tragic failure. And my husband, Mark? To them, he's just the awkward guy with a little computer hobby who never amounted to anything. We have always been the family joke, the punchline at every holiday dinner. My sister, Jessica, is the golden child. She's 30, loud, deeply arrogant, and the so-called CEO of a flashy lifestyle and cosmetics brand that my mother never stops bragging about. If Jessica sneezes, my mother calls the local paper. If I win a teaching award, my mother asks if it comes with a cash prize. I had spent months planning our 10th anniversary dinner. I booked a private table at the most exclusive French restaurant in the city, paying the deposit from my modest savings. It was supposed to be the night my family finally acknowledged our milestone. I just wanted one evening where Mark and I were celebrated, where my mother looked at us with pride instead of pity. But as I sat there, sipping warm water and watching the waiter clear away the unused place settings, the reality of my family's cruelty washed over me. I had worn my best dress, curled my hair, and arrived early, bursting with desperate, pathetic hope. What do you do when the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally treat you like an embarrassing afterthought? I checked my phone for the 100th time, staring at the blank screen. Nothing. My family had completely abandoned me on one of the most important nights of my life, leaving me utterly heartbroken. I was ready to leave, but Mark was about to completely change our world forever. Growing up with Jessica was an exercise in pure emotional starvation. My mother, Eleanor, made it clear very early on that love in our house was conditional, and the currency was status. When Jessica declared she was launching a business at 22, my mother liquidated a chunk of her savings to fund it. When I graduated with my teaching degree, I got a polite card and a lecture about how I'd never afford a luxury car on a public school salary. It was a constant, exhausting comparison that eroded my self-esteem piece by piece. When I met Mark 12 years ago, I fell in love with his quiet brilliance and his gentle heart. He was a software developer working out of a cramped apartment, pouring every spare hour into a complex data analytics platform he was building from scratch. My family despised him instantly. "He's a nerd going absolutely nowhere, Sarah," my mother hissed at my wedding reception, loud enough for half the guests to hear. "Jessica's dating an investment banker. Why do you always settle for the bottom of the barrel?" Over the last decade, their contempt only grew sharper. Jessica's lifestyle brand supposedly took off, and she became insufferable. She showed up to family gatherings in head-to-toe designer clothing, loudly complaining about her exhausting trips to Milan and Dubai. Mark and I drove a 10-year-old sedan and lived in a modest 2-bedroom townhouse. Whenever Mark tried to talk about his software company's slow but steady growth, Jessica would dramatically roll her eyes and change the subject to her latest magazine feature. "That's cute, Mark," she'd sneer, sipping her expensive wine. "But some of us are running real empires and creating actual wealth." Mark never argued back. He just smiled his quiet, knowing smile. I used to beg him to defend himself, to tell them how hard he worked, but he always refused to engage in their toxic game. I thought he was just incredibly patient, but he was actually holding a massive secret. Despite a decade of mistreatment, I still craved my mother's validation, which is why I put so much effort into planning our anniversary. A month before the date, I drove to my parents' house to personally invite them. Jessica was there, pacing the living room and aggressively typing on her phone. "A dinner? For 10 years? Fine, we'll be there." My mother, Eleanor, agreed smoothly, not looking up from her glossy magazine. "Jessica is launching a new cosmetics line that week, so we'll be exhausted from success, but we can definitely make a quick appearance." I was genuinely thrilled. I thought this was finally a turning point for our relationship. I booked the expensive restaurant, bought a new dress, and even ordered a custom cake. But in the days leading up to the dinner, strange little red flags started popping up everywhere. I stopped by my mother's house to drop off some mail that had been misdelivered to my place, and I walked into a tense, chaotic atmosphere. My mother was on the phone, her voice lowered to a panicked, trembling whisper. "I don't care what the early withdrawal penalty is, just wire the money from the retirement account today," she hissed before slamming the phone down when she saw me. Jessica looked absolutely awful. Her usually flawless makeup was smeared, and she was frantically shredding thick stacks of documents in the corner of the home office. When I gently asked if everything was okay, Jessica snapped at me with terrifying venom. "Not everything is about you and your pathetic little teacher life, Sarah. I am managing a massive global supply chain crisis right now." My mother quickly ushered me out the door, claiming they were just stressed about the upcoming product launch. I foolishly believed them, completely blinded by my desire to have a perfect family celebration. What do you do when the people who called you poor are secretly drowning in stolen money? I pushed the anxiety deep down and focused on the dinner, utterly unaware of the storm brewing. My desperate need for their love completely blinded me to their impending catastrophic ruin. The night of our 10th anniversary finally arrived, and I was buzzing with nervous energy. Mark and I arrived at the upscale French restaurant right on time. The table for 6 looked beautiful, adorned with fresh white roses and elegant crystal glasses. Mark held my hand, looking handsome in his tailored suit, but I could tell he was bracing himself for my family's usual snide comments. At 7:15 p.m., 15 minutes after they were supposed to arrive, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my mother. "So sorry, Sarah. Jessica has an unavoidable business emergency with her overseas manufacturers. It's a multi-million-dollar crisis. We have to stay at the office and help her sort it out. Happy anniversary, we'll send a gift." I sat there staring at the screen, my vision blurring with hot, humiliated tears. An unavoidable business emergency. Of course. Jessica's fictional crisis was far more important than my 10-year marriage. My father didn't even bother to text. He just let my mother do the dirty work. The waiter approached, politely asking if we were ready to order for the table, and the pity in his eyes absolutely broke me. "It's just the two of us tonight," I whispered, my voice cracking under the weight of a decade of rejection. Mark's jaw tightened. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell me it was going to be okay. He just pulled out his phone, typed a quick message, and then signaled for the waiter to bring the check for the water we had consumed. "We're leaving," Mark said firmly, standing up and offering me his hand. "Mark, no, we paid a massive deposit for this table," I cried, wiping my mascara. "I don't care about the deposit, Sarah," he replied, his voice vibrating with an unfamiliar, intense authority. "You are never going to cry over those people ever again. Wipe your tears and come with me right now." He led me out of the restaurant, and I had no idea where we were going. I climbed into our old sedan, feeling completely broken, but the night was far from over. We drove in absolute silence for 45 minutes, heading far away from the city center and deep into the wealthiest, most exclusive suburb in the state. I was too emotionally exhausted to ask questions. I just leaned against the cold window, replaying my mother's cruel text message over and over in my head. Finally, Mark turned off the main road and pulled up to a massive, wrought iron security gate. He rolled down his window, punched a code into the keypad, and the heavy gates silently swung open. We drove up a long, winding driveway lined with ancient oak trees until we reached a stunning, sprawling luxury estate. It looked like something out of a magazine, with manicured lawns, a grand stone facade, and massive windows glowing warmly in the dark. Mark parked our beat-up sedan right in front of the grand entrance, turned off the engine, and reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a heavy set of keys and a thick, official-looking envelope. He placed them in my trembling hands. "Happy anniversary, Sarah," he said, his eyes shining with profound emotion. "What is this?" I gasped, looking from the keys to the enormous mansion. "My data analytics platform," Mark began, his voice steady and calm. I didn't want to say anything until the ink was completely dry and the funds cleared. "A major tech conglomerate acquired my software company this morning. The buyout was finalized for $15 million. We own this house outright, Sarah. We never have to worry about money again." My brain completely short-circuited. $15 million. The husband my family had mocked relentlessly for a decade, the man they called a nerd going nowhere, had quietly built an empire right under their condescending noses. I burst into tears again, But this time they were tears of absolute, unadulterated shock and overwhelming joy. We walked into the grand foyer, and I felt like I was floating on air. But as we stood in our massive new kitchen, Mark's expression suddenly shifted to incredibly serious. "There's something else we need to talk about, Sarah," Mark said softly, guiding me to sit on one of the plush bar stools at the marble kitchen island. He pulled a sleek leather folder from his briefcase and laid it flat on the counter. "During the acquisition process, the conglomerate's legal team had to run intensive background checks on both of us," he explained, his tone shifting into something very clinical and precise. "It's standard procedure to ensure neither of us has any hidden liabilities, criminal ties, or financial entanglements that could compromise the buyout." I nodded slowly, still trying to process the fact that I was sitting in my own multi-million-dollar kitchen. As part of that sweep, the auditors ran cursory checks on our immediate family members. Mark continued, opening the folder. "Sarah, they found massive, screaming red flags regarding your sister and her company." My heart skipped a beat. I thought about the frantic document shredding, my mother's panicked phone call about early retirement withdrawals, and the sudden business emergency. Mark handed me a printed report prepared by a forensic accountant. "Jessica's lifestyle brand is a complete mirage. She doesn't have a global supply chain, and she definitely isn't generating millions in revenue. According to these public filings, her company has been operating at a massive, unsustainable loss for the last 4 years." I stared at the dense financial jargon, my mind spinning. "But she lives in a luxury penthouse. She flies first class. She has investors." I stammered. Mark shook his head grimly. "Her investors are a series of shell companies registered in Delaware, all funneling money into each other to create the illusion of cash flow. It's a classic Ponzi scheme setup." He flipped the page, pointing to a highlighted section. "But that's not the worst part, Sarah. Look at where her initial capital actually came from." I read the highlighted text, and the blood completely drained from my shocked face. I traced my finger over the stark black text on the auditor's report, barely comprehending the magnitude of the betrayal. The documents clearly showed multiple, massive loans taken out over the last 3 years. But they weren't in Jessica's name. They were secured by my parents' assets. "Mark, this says there are 3 separate liens on my parents' house," I whispered, feeling physically sick. "Their house has been paid off since I was in high school. Why would they leverage it now?" Mark sighed, tapping a secondary document. "Your parents didn't just leverage the house. They completely drained their 401k accounts. And according to these credit reports, there are 4 high-limit business credit cards maxed out under your father's name. Your sister has been systematically siphoning their entire net worth to fund her fake, glamorous lifestyle." The puzzle pieces were violently snapping together. The arrogant attitude, the designer clothes, the constant mockery of our modest life. It was all a frantic, expensive theater production funded by our parents' financial ruin. My mother hadn't been bragging about Jessica's success. She had been desperately trying to convince herself that their massive financial gamble was going to pay off. "So, Jessica's business is failing, and she dragged Mom and Dad down with her," I said, anger finally piercing through my shock. "They are going to lose everything they have." Mark leaned forward, his eyes dark with intensity. "It goes deeper than poor financial decisions, Sarah." The auditors noticed a discrepancy in the signatures on the most recent loan applications. He pulled out a magnified photocopy of a bank document. "Look closely at your father's signature on this home equity line of credit." I stared at the messy scrawl. My father had a very distinct, blocky handwriting. The signature on the paper was a loopy, hurried imitation. I looked up at Mark, my heart hammering furiously as the horrifying truth finally clicked. "That's not my dad's signature," I gasped, the paper shaking in my hands. "I grade middle school papers all day. I know a forged signature when I see one." Mark nodded slowly. "The auditors flagged it as highly suspicious. Given the timeline of the loan and your sister's desperate cash flow issues, it's extremely likely that Jessica committed identity theft. She forged your father's signature to secure $250,000 against their house without his knowledge." The realization hit me like a freight train. That was the real reason they bailed on our anniversary dinner. It wasn't an unavoidable business emergency or a supply chain crisis. My parents must have finally discovered the fraudulent loan, or perhaps a collection agency finally caught up with them. They spent our 10th anniversary meeting with a bankruptcy lawyer or trying to cover up a felony. I realized out loud, my voice trembling with a mix of fury and profound sorrow. While I was sitting in my best dress, crying over empty chairs, my mother was desperately trying to save the golden child from going to federal prison. Jessica had stolen their future, and my mother was still fiercely protecting her. All those years of being called poor, of being told Mark was a loser, while my sister was secretly committing massive financial fraud right under their noses. The sheer audacity was suffocating. Mark wrapped his arms around me, letting me cry out the last of my grief for a family that never really existed. When the tears stopped, they were replaced by a cold, hard, unyielding anger. They threw us away like garbage to protect a criminal. I whispered against his chest. What do we do now? Mark stepped back, a dangerous, brilliant glint in his eyes. Now, we let them find out about the $15 million, and we set a trap. We didn't have to wait long for the news to break. The tech conglomerate issued a press release about the acquisition on Monday morning, heavily featuring Mark as the brilliant developer behind the software. By Tuesday afternoon, my phone was absolutely blowing up. After a decade of radio silence on my birthdays and holidays, my mother suddenly had the time to call me 6 times in a row. I ignored them all, letting her frantic voicemails pile up. Sarah, darling, we saw the news on Bloomberg. We are just so incredibly proud of Mark. We need to celebrate your anniversary properly. The hypocrisy was physically nauseating. For 10 years, Mark was the punchline of their cruel jokes, a nerd going nowhere. Now that he was worth $15 million, he was suddenly their beloved son-in-law. Jessica texted me too, her tone sickeningly sweet, claiming her supply chain crisis was resolved and she was dying to see our new house. They were drowning in debt, facing foreclosure and potential criminal charges, and they saw Mark as their ultimate bailout. They want to celebrate, I told Mark, dropping my phone onto our marble counter. They want a piece of the pie. Mark smiled, a cold, calculating expression I had never seen before. Then let's give them a celebration they will never forget. Invite them over for dinner on Friday. We spent the next 3 days meticulously preparing. I hired a private catering company to serve a lavish 5-course meal in our grand dining room. I wanted the setting to be as intimidatingly wealthy as possible, stripping away any sense of superiority my family thought they still possessed. Meanwhile, Mark contacted his new legal team, making sure all the forensic accounting documents regarding Jessica's fraud were perfectly organized and legally sound. We were ready to expose everything. The heavy doorbell echoed through the massive foyer, and I took a deep, steadying breath. I opened the massive oak doors to find my mother, father, and Jessica standing on our front steps, their mouths practically hanging open as they took in the sheer scale of the estate. "Oh, Sarah, my sweet girl," my mother gasped, surging forward to pull me into a suffocating hug. She hadn't hugged me like that since I was a child. "This house, it's like a palace. We always knew Mark was a hidden genius." My father clapped Mark heavily on the shoulder, laughing a little too loudly. Jessica looked like she was actively swallowing glass. She was wearing her finest designer dress, but next to the quiet, undeniable wealth of our new home, she just looked desperate and garish. "It's gorgeous, Sarah," Jessica forced out, her eyes darting around the foyer, mentally calculating the square footage. "I'm so glad Mark's little computer project finally paid off." Even now, she couldn't resist a subtle dig. As I led them into the main living room, my mother clung to my arm, showering me with compliments about my hair, my outfit, and my exquisite taste. For a fleeting, pathetic second, a wave of guilt washed over me. I was finally getting the glowing maternal affection I had craved my entire life. They were sitting in my house, looking at me with admiration. I almost wanted to cancel the plan, to sweep everything under the rug, and just pretend we were a happy, normal family. I looked over at Mark, wrestling with my sudden hesitation. Mark caught my eye from across the room. He didn't look angry. He just looked at me with steady, unwavering strength, subtly tapping his jacket pocket where the flash drive was hidden. That simple gesture grounded me instantly, snapping me out of my toxic emotional relapse. I remembered the empty chairs at the restaurant. I remembered the forged signatures. My family wasn't here to love me. They were here to survive their own criminal collapse. I straightened my spine and confidently led them toward the grand, heavily staged dining room. The dining room was a masterpiece of intimidation. The long mahogany table was set with fine china, crystal goblets, and towering floral arrangements. We had a personal chef and 2 servers seamlessly delivering course after course. My parents were completely out of their depth, nervously watching which fork I used before picking up their own. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had completely shattered and reformed around me. By the time the main course, a perfectly seared Wagyu steak, was served, Jessica couldn't hold it in any longer. The desperation was practically leaking out of her pores. "So, Mark," Jessica began, swirling her wine glass with fake nonchalance. $15 million is a fantastic exit, but sitting on cash is a rookie mistake. You need to diversify. It just so happens that I am opening a new funding round for my cosmetics line. My mother eagerly chimed in, nodding vigorously. "Oh, it's true, Mark. Jessica's company is on the verge of exploding globally. Having you as a lead angel investor would keep the wealth in the family." I carefully set my knife down, watching the absolute shamelessness unfold. They missed our anniversary to deal with Jessica's massive financial crimes, and now they were boldly sitting at my table, eating my food, and trying to scam my husband out of his money to cover her tracks. It was sociopathic. "A lead angel investor?" Mark repeated politely, taking a sip of his water. "That sounds incredibly exciting, Jessica. I'm always looking for solid portfolios. I'd love to see your financials. In fact, I actually took the liberty of doing a little preliminary market research on your company." Jessica's fake smile faltered slightly, a flicker of genuine panic crossing her eyes. "Oh, you didn't have to do that," she stammered. "I can send you a curated pitch deck tomorrow." Mark stood up from the table, pulling a small remote from his pocket. "No need, Jessica. Let's just look at the real numbers right now." Mark pressed the small remote, and a hidden projector screen descended from the dining ceiling. The room went dead silent as the projector hummed to life, casting a bright square of light onto the screen at the head of the table. Mark connected his tablet, and the first slide appeared. It wasn't a sleek marketing graph. It was a brutal, black-and-white bank statement. "Let's review the portfolio," Mark said, his voice cold and analytical. "Here we see your primary operating account, Jessica. A net loss of $400,000 last year alone." My mother gasped, dropping her fork onto her china plate with a sharp clatter. "Mark, what is this?" my father demanded, his face flushing red. "This is highly inappropriate." "What's inappropriate, Richard, is funding a fake empire through identity theft," Mark fired back, clicking to the next slide. A massive scan of the home equity line of credit appeared on the screen, with the forged signature highlighted in bright yellow. "My auditors found the Delaware shell companies. We found the fake investors. And most importantly, we found the $250,000 lien secretly taken out on your primary residence." Jessica went completely pale, shrinking back into her expensive chair as if she had been physically struck. My father stared at the screen, his eyes wide with uncomprehending horror. He looked at the signature, then slowly turned his head to look at his golden child. "Jessica," my father whispered, his voice trembling violently. Did you take a loan out against our house?" "It was just a bridge loan. I was going to pay it back after the new launch." Jessica shrieked, her composed CEO persona completely disintegrating into panic. "You lied to us," my mother cried, clutching her chest as she finally realized the full extent of the nightmare. "You said the bankruptcy lawyer was just for restructuring. You stole your father's identity." The luxurious dining room erupted into absolute chaos as the undeniable truth finally crashed down. The fallout was instantaneous and explosive. My father leaped from his chair, his face purple with rage, screaming at Jessica about the forged documents. "I am going to lose my house because of your vanity," he roared, slamming his fists on the mahogany table. Jessica burst into hysterical tears, desperately trying to shift the blame. "You pressured me. You both expected me to be a millionaire. You wouldn't love me if I wasn't successful," she screamed back, accidentally exposing the toxic core of our entire family dynamic. My mother just sat there, sobbing uncontrollably into her napkin, her entire worldview completely shattered. She had sacrificed her retirement, her home, and her relationship with me to worship a daughter who was nothing but a manipulative criminal. Through all the screaming and crying, Mark and I sat perfectly still at the other end of the table, watching the empire of lies burn to the ground. Finally, my mother looked up at me, her face streaked with mascara, her eyes pleading. "Sarah, please," she begged, her voice pathetic and small. "Mark has so much money now. 15 million. Please, just pay off the lien. If the bank forecloses, your father and I will be homeless. We can keep this in the family. We can fix this." The sheer audacity of her request hung in the air. After decades of emotional abuse, after abandoning me on my anniversary to cover up a felony, she was actually asking my husband to buy them out of their criminal consequences. I looked at the woman who had made me feel worthless for 32 years. I felt no anger anymore, just a profound, hollow pity. I stood up, picked up my napkin, and placed it neatly next to my plate. "Mom, you made it very clear my whole life that we belong to two different worlds," I said calmly. I looked at the three of them and delivered the final, totally devastating blow. "We are not giving you a single cent," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the grand room. "You chose to enable her. You chose to ignore the red flags. You missed our anniversary to protect a fraud. This is your mess, and you are going to face the consequences alone." Jessica let out a wail of pure despair, but my parents were completely silent, utterly crushed by the finality in my voice. "Get out of my house," I commanded, "and do not ever contact us again." The servers quietly opened the front doors, and my family slowly walked out into the night, stripped of their pride, their wealth, and their illusions. The aftermath over the next few months was brutal for them. We refused to bail them out, and the financial dominoes quickly fell. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings on my parents' home. When the fraud department investigated the forged lien, the evidence was undeniable. Jessica was arrested and charged with multiple counts of wire fraud and identity theft. Because my father refused to go to jail for her crimes, he testified against her to save himself. The golden child is currently awaiting sentencing and is looking at real federal prison time. My parents had to declare total bankruptcy and move into a cramped, low-income apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. The elite social circles my mother cared about so deeply entirely completely shunned them. I blocked their numbers, their emails, and their social media accounts. I instituted incredibly strict boundaries, utilizing Mark's lawyers to send a cease and desist letter when my mother tried to show up at my school to beg for cash. It was a harsh, agonizing process, but cutting out the infection was the only way I could truly begin to heal. I finally realized that blood does not automatically make someone your true, unconditionally loving family. It has been a year since that catastrophic dinner, and my life looks completely different now. I didn't quit my middle school teaching job. I genuinely love my students, and standing in front of my classroom keeps me firmly grounded, reminding me every day of the real value of honest, hard work. Mark used a portion of his wealth to set up a massive charitable foundation that funds STEM programs in underfunded public schools, turning his little computer hobby into a legacy of genuine, lasting good. We live peacefully in our beautiful home, surrounded only by friends who love us for who we are, not for what we can buy them. Intensive therapy has helped me unpack decades of narcissistic abuse and familial gaslighting. I learned that you can spend your entire life twisting yourself into painful knots trying to win the approval of toxic people, but it will never be enough because their emotional emptiness is a bottomless pit. If you are dealing with family members who constantly belittle your achievements, compare you to others, or demand your blind loyalty while offering nothing but conditional love in return, please walk away. Do not let them define your worth for another second. The hardest lesson I ever had to learn was that the family I desperately wanted never actually existed. It was just an illusion I chased while ignoring the incredible man standing right beside me. Mark was my real family all along. He saw my immense value when I was wearing thrift store clothes and crying in an empty restaurant. And he was the one who built a fortress to protect me when the horrible truth finally came crashing down. True wealth isn't found in designer labels, luxury cars, or fake cosmetic empires. It's found in the quiet, unshakable loyalty of the people who show up for you when the chairs are empty. Tonight, Mark and I are celebrating our 11th anniversary, and our beautiful table is perfectly full.